How's everybody doing this morning?
Great.
Welcome to HighFive.
Yes.
All right, so I'm David Minton. I'm the managing partner of Design Hammer, and it's my pleasure to present to you Stress Addiction from Morning Coffee to the Cardiac Wing with Taylor Cashton. Yay! So Taylor is the global design lead at Fidelity Investments, Raleigh-based multidisciplinary creative and community builder that's passionate about people, design, and all the intersections in between. He specializes in visual design with an emphasis on brand building, event design, and marketing design. He explores the worlds of interface design, animation, and monoline illustration in his downtime. He brings to the table a burning desire to collaborate with teams tasked with creating exceptional work for people who give a shit.
Yeah. Yes.
That sounds impressive.
Thank you, Taylor.
It's him.
Okay, sweet. So the funny part about this is this whole thing's on stress addiction, and I was like working last night, like trying to finish this. Okay, well thank you for attending my breakout session. As David said, I'm Taylor. And I know this is right before the lunch hour, and you guys had a pretty busy morning, but thanks for being here. So to start though, I want to take a quick pulse. So by show of hands, how many of you had, after a full day of work, gone home and just needed like time alone to detox because you've been so stressed out? Yeah, cool. How many of you have been slapped with a project at the last minute and pulled your hair out to try and get it finished? Yeah, cool. How many of you just couldn't say no to something you were asked to take on because you would have felt bad or felt that you were letting someone down? Yeah, cool. Well, today may serve as a bit of a warning. My story and the other things I'm going to talk about take place in the workplace, at home, in our social lives, and all the places in between. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about myself and how I got here. I'll talk a little bit about the way the brain works, and then I'll tell you a story and close with some things I've learned. So, as David said, I'm Taylor Cashton. I'm currently the design lead for Fidelity Investments and the director of Uniting People for AIGA Raleigh, the Professional Association for Design. But way before that, I was born in the center of Long Island, a town called Belmore in the hectic state of New York. That being said, it's worth noting that when I get into the flow of things, I tend to talk quickly. So if I'm going too fast, give me a nod, flip me off, do something, and I'll slow down. So I was a bit of a sassy kid growing up. And this photo's funny because my mom used to take me to photo shoots when I was a kid, and I found this photo in the trash. And I was like, this is the best picture I've ever seen. Now, the funnier part about this is I tried searching for a more recent one, because I used to wear my hats like that a lot. And instead I found this from 2008. And I think I had the first duck face image ever. Can we also note that I used to think it was cool to wear a rubber duck pendant? This is super weird. Anyway, so a few years before that photo was taken, my family moved to North Carolina for a better life. In middle and high school, I was part of every club that would accept me, every extracurricular we can afford, and none of that was because my parents needed to ship me off to keep me busy. I just genuinely involved having a packed schedule. I like being involved in anything I can get my hands on. When I got to college, it was no different, right? I was a full-time student, I was an editor for the newspaper, I was starting to freelance, in some design work, and I had a contract gig with HBO, essentially doing field marketing for Raleigh and Durham, which, by the way, dream job. But when I left college and entered the professional world, nothing changed. I just started to sub out some of those fun activities for others, right? Oftentimes just adding to my to-do list on my schedule. Full-time job, continuing to freelance, helping through local events, running meetup groups, becoming active in professional organizations, the list goes on. It was only then that I realized I had an addiction. I enjoyed stress, right? I threw myself into high-pressure situations with all sorts of constraints, all compounding together to create this enormous to-do list that was pretty much self-imposed. I was addicted to cortisol. What's cortisol? Well, I'm glad you asked. Cortisol is the stress hormone. It's created by your adrenal glands. The idea is that when cortisol is released in your bloodstream, it can act on different parts of the body to kind of either help you deal with stress or get out of danger, etc. It's the chemical that's directly linked to the fight or flight response that your body reacts to different scenarios. But let's level set. So my dependency on cortisol was not at the production level. Like my body didn't produce too much or too little. Those are like actual medical conditions. I just gambled on how my body would respond to cortisol. By overcommitting myself, I was banking on the fact that I'd get super stressed out and always choose the fight in the fight or flight and power through in some sort of super creativity state and crush whatever I was working on. So because I was a serial procrastinator, this is exactly what I was doing all the time with everything, right? The challenge here, though, is for the longest time it seemed effective because the output was creativity and productivity. So I was meeting all my deadlines, I was making cool work, I was exceeding expectations at work and with my clients, so it seemed all good. This continual stress, to me, was triggering this like flow state, right, where I was performing at my personal best. Performance, though, is an interesting metric to try and track, and being this is a marketing and design conference, we can start off with a statistic. So Adobe put out a survey that said that 71% of creatives produce 10 times more content than they did just 5 years ago. Now, the stat alone I think is pretty cool, right? Because the sheer number of new tools that are out there, the new content forums and mediums, the new disciplines you can study under. But it's worth noting that this particular study was from 2017. So the issue with it is now, to me, when I read this statistic, I read it as 71% of creatives are responsible for 10 times more content today than they were 5 years ago. That's terrifying. Not only does it mean that we're working way more, but it means we're prone to increased stress and anxiety. It leads to toxic forms of comparison, more commonly known as the comparison trap, where you compare yourselves to others that you're working with or that you admire or you're following without recognizing that everyone's got their own path, their own set of constraints, their own path and journey to get to where they're at. And worse off, the idea of the Superman syndrome, where you feel like you have to swoop in and save the day because if you don't do it, no one else will. So all this does really is add pressure to your plate, right? More and more stress. Some of this, though, unfortunately, we brought upon ourselves by nurturing and encouraging this idea like a hustle mentality, right? The rhetoric we see and hear dubbed as motivational content or at some of these conferences is all about like optimizing your time or hacking your schedule, right? Or worse yet, you see content like this on like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, right? Or even some of this stuff on YouTube, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of Elon Musk and Will Smith and Gary Vee and probably whoever this other guy is. But these messages, like these headlines, are so distilled and out of context that it makes everything sound so simple, right? And the funny part is I used to blame the people that were like in these videos for devaluing the hard work they put in to get there. But then I realized we did this to ourselves. It took a video editor to make this. It took a content marketer to push it out. It took a content writer or a copywriter to write the content for the video. A designer to make some of those other pages before. We made all this shit, right? We're the ones taking the story of long, hard work and trying to make it into a snippet of edible content. And then we eat it up, right? We hashtag it, we share it around, and all this does is change our internal perception over time. Hustle and everything will be fine. Work harder and it'll all work out. Do more so you can stand out. Get more involved so you can make a name for yourself. You know, there's no definitive attribution to this quote, but how many of you have heard the phrase, find a job you like and you'll never work a day in your life? Yeah, me too. But I like this one better from Adam J. Kurtz. It reads, do what you love. And you'll work super fucking hard all the time with no separation or boundaries and take everything extremely personally. For some reason, this one seems more accurate, right? But when do we make this shift? When do we decide that we should never turn our brains off, never put the pencil down, never step away from the keyboard, right? Or hell, give yourself time to breathe. Who decided that monetizing your hobbies or the things you enjoy is like the right thing to do, right? Not to mention the implication that comes along with all this, that if you're not working yourself to death, then you're not being productive. It's a toxic way of viewing the work ethic, you know, but when we're only hearing micro stories from those who've made it or via this content we've made, it's hard to not idolize or, you know, storytell around the struggle. We say things like, if you're not freelancing, you're not creating enough. Or if you don't have a passion project, you're not exploring your craft. Or if you don't have a side hustle, then you're not serious, right? What we seem to constantly forget is we don't need anything of any of these things to like feel fulfillment. And we don't have to stress ourselves out to make work that matters. We shouldn't simply try to keep busy to try and counter the lack of fulfillment that we're not getting from the things we're doing, or quite frankly, the people we're with. The if you're not doing everything, you're basically doing nothing mantra that we keep telling ourselves needs to die. The irony, though, is 2 years ago I was the worst culprit. So I'll tell you a story. By show of hands, though, how many of you know how to read your heart rate? Cool, small group, that's good. So let's start by taking a reading together. So those of you with smartwatches, activate your little heart rate reader. And those of you without, take 2 fingers and you put them underneath your jaw or on your wrist. And look at me when you can feel a pulse. Cool. So when I say go, we're going to count your beats like for 15 seconds. I'll do it out loud, count to yourself. And then I'll stop you. Ready, set, go. Okay, stop. So now multiply that number by 4. I'll give you a second to use your phone. I'm bad at math too. So you now have your resting heart rate. So the average heart rate of an adult is between, or resting heart rate is between 60 and 90 beats per minute. Sometimes a little lower for those more athletically fit. Raise your hand if your heart rate fell between that range. Cool. So it probably sounded something like this. Right? Well, on June 29th, 2017, I woke up dizzy, disoriented, and drenched in sweat, with both my chest and my head pounding. Assuming I had a nightmare or just slept really bad, I wandered into the bathroom and tried to kind of snap myself out of it. Washed my face, took a shower, started getting ready for work. The dizziness eventually faded, and so did the disorientation and the sweat, but the pitter-patter that was happening in my chest kind of stayed. Thinking nothing of it, I instinctually texted my mom saying, "Hey, my chest feels funny," and then left to go to work. When I sat down on my desk at work, I was both winded and full of energy, which is a very bizarre combination of feelings to have at the same time. And the pitter-patter I was talking about before was quite distracting. So I called in a coworker, prefacing that I had a weird request. So when she came into my office, I asked her to put her hand on my chest and tell me if she felt the same weird, thing going on, just to make sure I wasn't going nuts. She confirmed my suspicion, and it was clear it was time to do something. So thankfully, my doctor was just up the street from my office at the time, so I went there first. Not being able to pinpoint what was happening either, he recommended heading to the hospital. So he called ahead, and I left. But instead of waiting or paying for the ambulance, I drove myself to the ER. When arriving at the hospital, because we called ahead, it was practically all hands on deck. There was like nurses and people all over the place, and doctors like applying little EKG nodes and getting ready for like IVs and rolling in oxygen carts. It was wild. And thanks to all these like weird, sticky things that was going on, I realized that my heart rate was 180 beats a minute sitting still. Just to make that clear though, so this steady heart rate that we were talking about before kind of looks like this, right? It sounded like this. This is one of my actual EKGs, and this is normal. This is 75, right? This is what my heart should have sounded like sitting on that bed. But in reality, it sounded more like this, right? Now mind you, I was literally sitting still on a bed with my feet up. So these are both, like I said, EKGs from that morning. This one obviously first, and the other one was later in the day. You can see when I overlay them how fast that difference is. Right? So this black line is the regular rate, this red one is the accelerated rate. And it's almost double in every spot that the single beat was hitting. So the first thing they wanted to try was to chemically reduce my heart rate, right? So that was the IV drip that they were putting in. And when that didn't work, it was apparent that it was time to update mom, right? General note here, nothing good comes from starting the morning with, "I'm having chest pains," and then minimal contact afterwards. Yeah. So knowing I'd been less than transparent, and also knowing if I underwent any procedure without telling my mom first, I would likely leave the hospital in worse condition than when I submitted, it was time to call mom. So the other interesting thing to mention here is that my mom had just had knee surgery, so she couldn't drive, right? So she had to literally call an Uber to bring her to the hospital. But when I decided to call her to kind of let her know what was going on, the doctors were already ready to go. They were at the point where like, we need to do something now. But mom wasn't there, so I couldn't give the green light, right? Not to mention I was pretty terrified, because the next step was to put me under and try to shock my heart back into rhythm, right? Once she arrived, though, it was time to put me under. So gave me an anesthetic. 3 zaps later, no luck, right? Which resulted in a 2-day staycation at Rex Hospital under constant observation, which meant a bunch of blood tests, scans, pricks, prods, and about 100 of those little sticky pads they use for the EKG machines. Mind you, I'm of Italian and Middle Eastern descent, so chest hair, sticky pads, not an ideal way of spending Wednesday. The diagnosis, though, after I passed all the other tests with a clean bill of health, stress-induced atrial fibrillation, or AFib for short. It sounds like I make a pretty solid name for a metal band, right? Fun fact, this font is called Eater of Children. So, in case you want to know now. Yeah. The way it was ultimately explained to me is an electrical overload of the chambers of the heart, causing them to beat irregularly. Meaning, instead of being sent signals of when to hit the drum by the conductor, every drummer was doing their own drum solo whenever they felt like it. I picture it kind of as 2 toddlers driving a minivan, right? One in the driver's seat, just kind of doing this thing, and one at the pedals. When they're in sync, it's like functional, but kind of scary, and no one really knows what's happening. But when they're not, the toddler at the pedals is playing patty cake, right? You know, stop, go, and the driver at the top has no idea what's going on. The tricky thing about AFib is there really isn't much that can be done to monitor or treat it unless you're currently experiencing the arrhythmia or the irregular heartbeat. So doctors can speculate, they can make predictions, but the normal causes are ruled out, like drugs, age, poor health, obesity, diabetes. You know, it's kind of just up to your body to do its own thing. Since that first instance in June, I've had 3 run-ins with these pesky toddlers. One of which my body worked itself out of by the time I got into the ER, so it was a lot of money for nothing. One of them I had to get shocked to get back into rhythm, and the third I was able to kind of decrease my heart rate just via breathing exercises. The part that's more weird, especially to the doctors, is these incidents weren't triggered by any event, right? Most of the time AFib is triggered by a death in the family, a life event, you know, missed deadline, some kind of increased event of like heightened attention. But every time I had it, I woke up in the irregular heartbeat already. So I could have been in that 180 beats a minute thing for hours before I actually woke up. This experience like flipped my entire productivity game on its head. I was always the I do my best work under pressure kind of person. I'll channel the stress, you know, of everything to my to-do list so that I can power through. It's well known that stress is often an intro or gateway into other forms of addiction, albeit drugs, bad habits, shitty crowds, other people. So in tandem, I thought maybe it was possible that my stress caused this loop, right, of where I craved more stress instead of coping with the stress I was dealing with. Being that my stress generally has a positive output, right, so productivity, maybe my brain misread the false positive as a healthy behavior. Arguably, I was using a derivative of what's called the self-medication theory to cope with stress. Basically, the theory says that people who are in increased states of stress often turns to drug or other means to decrease that stress. No doubt, right? But my drug, in this case, was my task list. I figured the more I had, the better I'd feel. My brain didn't know how to regulate the stress I was currently experiencing, and instead of dealing with it, I drowned it out with more work because it felt like something I could control. So essentially, I created my own little toxic loop that I seemingly couldn't break. This happened all the time, for years. I get a kick out of this comic because it's a very simplistic way to show what was happening that day, except with caffeine. Stress out? Just have another cup of coffee and power through, right? It's obvious now how shitty of a plan that was and ultimately a lifestyle. I read a quote from an author and stress management specialist named Debbie Mandel that reads, "Stress robs you of your identity, but doing what you love helps you reclaim it." And I think it's an interesting quote for 2 reasons. One of which, it's not always the easiest thing to do, right? You can't always spend the time doing things you enjoy, which sucks. But the second is, I feel like, depending on how you read this quote, it almost accidentally encourages overwork, right? To do more, to try to get yourself into a better place. A few weeks after my diagnosis, I was a bit of a wreck, right? On the outside, I seemed pretty calm and collected, but internally, anytime I even thought I was feeling weird, I'd immediately, check my pulse. Some family and friends noticed and asked about it, but I don't think I was ready to accept what was going on or address it. I even figured I could solve my semi-obsession with checking my heart rate with technology, hence the Apple Watch, right? And to be honest, it gave me a sense of relief because I figured, a good portion of the time I was manually checking my heart rate, it was all phantom feelings anyway. So with technology on my side, I figured if there was a real emergency, it would let me know. This little crutch, though, empowered me to worry less about it, which was ultimately, probably for the better. But if my AFib diagnosis has taught me anything, it's that all of this pretty much could have been avoided, or at least mitigated, with 4 pretty basic steps. The first of which is to ask, right? You have to ask yourself the tough questions. And these questions just cover 3 pretty basic constructs. The first of which is ask yourself about your tasks, right? Do you really have to do it all? Are all of these things necessary right now? Are these the right things? You have to ask yourself about the people around you. Are these the right people? Do they encourage your success? Are they helping you and you them? And finally, ask yourself, what's your plan, right? How does what you're doing now and who you're doing it with lead into the next thing? It doesn't have to be concrete, but there's got to be some kind of alignment there. Otherwise you're just running around, as like a chicken without a head, right? So ask yourself, is there some kind of method to your madness? Asking yourself these tough questions leads to less stress. It's a fact. The second step is saying, fuck it, right? It's time to trim the fat. You don't really need to be taking on all the work or tasks that you're doing. You have to start learning to say no. No to projects you have no interest in, no to work that will literally overload you, and no to plans you really don't want to participate in. On the same note, sometimes you have to say fuck it to the people in your circle, especially the ones that breathe nothing but negativity and stagnation, and that's the hardest one. Especially if they're not building you up and you them, right? Your circle should be the ones clapping the loudest when you have success, and there to mentor you through your failures. If they're not doing that, it's time for a new circle. And lastly, is your plan the right plan? Does it include the right pieces? Is it considering the right timeline or whatever? No? Fuck it. Saying fuck it means less stress. Plus foul language is fun. The flip side of step 2 is step 3. Incubate. It's time to double down on the things that move the needle. The people and the things that make you happy. Right? You can do this by incubating your time, your things, and your circle. Let's say you had 2 hours of time, just kind of blocked out in a day, and you're originally going to try to tackle some new projects. The options on the table seem like one you're really into and something you like doing and it'll kind of help you, versus another one that's kind of like, you probably should do it, it's kind of you pushing it off for a while, but it's there, right? And your normal plan of attack would be to split that 2-hour block between 1 and 1. I say no. Double down that 2 hours on the one that brings you joy and furthers your actual goals, right? If something's telling you don't do this, you probably shouldn't do it. This also extends back to the people you surround yourself with. There's another speaker whose name is Jim Rohn, who's attributed with saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. It's time you curate and nurture that circle so that the people around you can help each other succeed, right? Celebrate your circle's wins as if they were your own, and always give more than you can take. Incubating the things you enjoy leads to less stress. Now, the last one is the simplest, but often the hardest to do. You have to learn to just be, right? Be intentional about the choices you make. Be intentional about the tasks you take on. And be intentional about the actions you carry out. And more importantly, be present when making those decisions, working on those tasks, and doing those things. According to Lauren Roche, PhD, a meditation instructor and author, there's over 100 types of meditation practices. He says something like karaoke is a gateway to meditation. It's a joyous expression followed by relief. He goes on to say that individuals should pick an aspect of their life and build a meditative practice around it, something they love and enjoy. Because practicing mental health or meditation doesn't mean sitting with your legs crossed saying Om, trying to clear your mind. Roche says it's through welcoming tension that you actually get to release it. Being wholly present and intentional as much as possible leads to less stress. So I think we could all use a little bit of AFib in our lives, right? Not this kind, obviously, but this kind. It's important to remember that none of this happens overnight. Like, that's the core construct here. I've been trying to live by these principles since my hospital staycation, and I still have 3 instances afterwards where my heart kind of did whatever it wanted to. It's a process, but now I'm almost a year without an incident. And the truth is, I'm not really an expert, right? But I have learned that you have to be patient with yourself. Give yourself time to adjust and your body to adapt. I read another quote that doesn't seem to have a definitive origin or attribution, but I really like it. And I'm going to leave it up here for a second because it's kind of long. It reads, Destroy the idea that you have to be constantly working or grinding in order to be successful. Embrace the concept that rest, recovery, reflection are essential parts of progress towards a successful and ultimately happy life.
Whose quote is that?
It's unattributed. There's a lot of places where people have claimed where they have a reference, but there's no definitive source.
You're not putting your name on it?
No. Although I could. Taylor. Yeah. By me. And I'll kind of leave you with this. So the heart's an interesting organ, right? Because it really controls a lot of things for you. But it can also be heavily influenced by your behavior. If you treat it well, it'll treat you well. And by continually running through those 4 pieces of the HighFive process, even out of order, hopefully you can keep your stress at bay and live happier, more fulfilling life. Thank you.